On a quiet morning flight, passengers were settling into their seats when something unexpected shattered the calm. Airport security walked straight down the aisle and stopped in front of one woman, a successful black CEO traveling for what should have been a routine business trip. Without warning, they ordered her to stand up. Confused eyes filled the cabin as whispers spread. Some passengers reached for their phones, sensing something wasn't right. Within moments, she was escorted off the plane as if she had done something wrong. No explanation, no apology, just humiliation in front of an entire cabin of strangers. But what no one on that aircraft knew was that the woman they had just removed wasn't powerless. In fact, by the end of that day, one decision she made would shake the airline's future and put $5 billion on the line. The question is, how did a moment of discrimination on a routine flight turn into a financial disaster for a billion-dollar company? And why did the airline realize too late who they had just forced off that plane? For most people on that early morning flight, it was just another routine trip. But for Imani Carter, the journey meant something more. Imani wasn't just another passenger. She was the founder and CEO of a rapidly growing investment firm, a woman who had spent nearly 2 decades building her reputation from the ground up. Starting with little more than determination and a small office, she had worked her way into rooms where very few people who looked like her were ever invited. Her company now managed billions in investments, partnering with major corporations and helping fund projects across the country. To the business world, Imani Carter represented discipline, intelligence, and quiet power. But to strangers who didn't know her story, she was just another traveler in Seat 3A. That morning, she was flying to attend a critical meeting with airline executives, one that could finalize a massive multi-billion-dollar funding partnership. It was supposed to be a turning point for both her company and the airline. Imani arrived early, dressed professionally, moving with the calm confidence of someone used to high-stakes decisions. She boarded the plane like everyone else, greeting the flight attendant with a polite smile before settling into her seat. Nothing seemed unusual. But somewhere between boarding and takeoff, something changed. A quiet conversation started near the front of the cabin. A glance, then another. Within minutes, security officers were walking down the aisle, straight toward her. Passengers watched, confused, because in a matter of seconds, a routine business flight was about to turn into a moment that would humiliate one passenger and cost an airline more than they could have ever imagined. At first, it was just a feeling. Imani Carter noticed the stares before anything was said. 2 airline employees standing near the front of the cabin kept glancing in her direction. They whispered to each other, looked back again, then spoke quietly into a radio. She tried to ignore it. Business travel had taught her something over the years. Sometimes people stare, sometimes they assume things they shouldn't. The best response was often calm professionalism. She opened her laptop, reviewing notes for the meeting waiting for her after the flight. But the whispers didn't stop. Minutes later, 2 security officers stepped onto the plane. Their presence immediately shifted the mood inside the cabin. Conversations faded. Passengers looked up from their phones. One of the officers scanned the rows slowly until his eyes locked on Seat 3A. Imani. They walked straight toward her. Every step down the aisle felt deliberate, heavy, impossible to ignore. By the time they stopped beside her seat, the entire row had gone silent. One officer spoke briefly to the flight attendant. The attendant nodded and stepped back. Then the words came. She was asked to stand up. Confused, Imani calmly asked if there had been some kind of mistake. Her boarding pass was valid. Her seat assignment was correct. She had boarded like every other passenger. But the officers didn't explain. Instead, they repeated the request, this time louder, firm enough that nearby passengers turned fully in their seats to watch. The tension inside the cabin thickened. A man across the aisle quietly pulled out his phone. Another passenger whispered, "What did she do?" But that was the problem. She hadn't done anything. Imani felt the familiar knot forming in her chest, the one she had felt before in boardrooms where people assumed she was the assistant instead of the CEO, the one she felt when security guards followed her through stores, the quiet, exhausting weight of being judged before she even spoke. Still, she stayed calm. She stood up slowly. "Can you tell me what this is about?" she asked. No answer. Instead, the officers instructed her to gather her belongings. Now the whispers were louder. Passengers were openly staring. A woman a few rows back shook her head in confusion. Someone muttered that this didn't make sense. But the officers weren't interested in explanations. They guided Imani toward the aisle. Step by step, she walked past rows of strangers watching her as if she had done something terrible. Humiliation burned in her chest. By the time they reached the front of the plane, nearly everyone was watching. Phones were out now, recording. And that's when something even stranger happened. Just before she stepped off the aircraft, one of the officers finally spoke. Not an apology, not an explanation. Instead, a vague claim about a security concern. But the words didn't add up. Because back at the gate, as Imani stood surrounded by airline staff demanding answers, she noticed something that made the situation even more disturbing. One employee was staring at a tablet screen. Her name was displayed clearly on it, which meant something important. They knew exactly who she was. And yet, they had removed her anyway. What the airline didn't realize in that moment was that the woman they had just humiliated wasn't simply a passenger. She was the very investor scheduled to decide whether their company would receive $5 billion in funding later that day. And in just a few hours, that decision was about to change everything. The gate area had gone quiet. Imani Carter stood surrounded by airline staff and security officers, her carry-on still in her hand, the sting of humiliation hanging in the air. Passengers were still inside the aircraft, some watching through the windows, others recording from the jet bridge. And still, no one could give her a real explanation. Just the same vague words repeated again and again. Security concern. But now the situation was beginning to shift. Because a senior airline manager had arrived at the gate, holding a tablet and speaking urgently with one of the staff members. His eyes kept moving from the screen to Imani, then back again. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Imani watched as his expression slowly changed, from confusion to disbelief. He stepped closer. For the first time since the incident began, someone actually looked at her carefully, studying her face, then the name displayed on the tablet. Imani Carter. The same name listed on the airline's meeting schedule for later that morning. The same name attached to a private investment firm preparing to finalize a $5 billion funding deal that could transform the airline's future. The manager's face drained of color. Because in that moment, the truth hit him like a shockwave. The woman they had just dragged off their plane was the investor they were supposed to meet in just a few hours. The person whose signature could secure billions for their struggling expansion project. Suddenly the tone changed. Staff members began whispering urgently. One employee rushed to make a phone call. Another tried to approach Imani with a nervous smile that hadn't been there moments earlier. But the damage had already been done. Passengers were still recording. Phones were still pointed in her direction. And the humiliation she had just experienced couldn't be erased with a quick apology. Imani stood there silently, watching the panic spread through the airline employees as they slowly realized the magnitude of their mistake. For them, it was a crisis. For her, it was a decision. Because in just a few hours, she would be sitting across from the airline's top executives. And now there was only one question left. After everything that had just happened, would she still give them the $5 billion they were counting on? For the airline, the next few hours were filled with damage control. Executives rushed into emergency meetings. Calls were made. Apologies were drafted. Someone even suggested sending a private car, offering upgrades, anything that might smooth over what had just happened. But for Imani Carter, the situation was no longer about convenience or comfort. It was about dignity. Just hours after being escorted off that plane in front of dozens of strangers, she sat across from the same airline executives who had been expecting a routine business meeting. The atmosphere in the room was tense, heavy with unspoken panic. They knew what was at stake. $5 billion in potential investment, funding that could expand routes, modernize aircraft, and secure the airline's future for years to come. But before anyone could begin their carefully prepared presentation, Imani calmly placed a single folder on the table. Inside was a statement, not of partnership, but of withdrawal. Her firm would not move forward with the investment. Not after what had happened. The room fell silent. Because in that moment, the airline didn't just lose a deal. They lost the trust of someone who had come ready to build something bigger, someone who had believed they were entering a partnership built on respect. Instead, she had been treated like a threat. News of the incident spread quickly. Passengers' recordings began circulating online, sparking outrage and difficult conversations across the country. For many people watching, the story felt painfully familiar, a reminder that success, wealth, or titles don't always shield someone from prejudice. Imani Carter walked away from that meeting with her reputation intact. The airline walked away with a lesson that cost them billions. But the deeper question remains bigger than any company or contract. If a powerful CEO can be treated this way in public, what happens to those whose stories are never recorded? And how many more moments like this will it take before the world finally decides that respect should never depend on who someone thinks you are?